Empires crumble and things fall apart. A presentation on postcolonial Africa as it relates to the titular book, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, prepared by me, Bataj Jackson. Turning and turning. In the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. W. B. Yeats, The Second Coming. This is how Things Fall Apart opens. And, okay, it sounds deep, but what does it mean, assuming it means anything at all? And what does it have to do with postcolonial Africa? Well, I'll get back to this because I can't effectively convince you of what I believe it means here without first explaining its proper context. Don't worry, I'll explain it at the end in my own words. So without further ado, let's get started. In the 19th century, in the year of the Berlin Conference, 1885, the empires of Europe met to discuss how they ought to divide inland Africa amongst themselves as to avoid conflict with each other. They all sought to expand their colonial territories so that they may spread commerce to increase their own wealth, Christianity, and civilization. However, before this historic meeting of world powers, Great Britain had outlawed their slave trade with its 1833 Slavery Abolition Act, and thus they were eager to find new markets from which to profit. Thus, during that historic meeting, it was decided Igboland, also known as southeastern Nigeria, would go to Great Britain. For Igboland was rich in palm oil, and palm oil made excellent lubricant for machinery, making it a resource that would become exceedingly valuable as Great Britain continued to undergo industrialization. It is in this period of the history of colonial Africa that the book Things Fall Apart takes place. However, the book itself was written in 1958 when Africa was going through decolonization, and it was at this time that the book's author, Chinua Achebe, lived. Chinua Achebe was a man who hailed from two worlds, as his father had been a Christian missionary and the rest of his family adhered to the traditional religion of the Igbo people. This duality gave Achebe a unique perspective on both colonialism and those being colonized, and it is from this post-colonial context that Things Fall Apart springs into existence. As Achebe's intention in writing the book was to retell the story of his experience with European culture in a way that he found acceptable and to counter the traditional European view of Africa and the people that lived there, replacing it with something reflective of real humans, something that captures their nuances and complexities for better and for worse. Achebe spends more than the first half of Things Fall Apart doing just as he intended as we the audience are immersed into the pre-colonial culture of the Igbo people, which he has masterfully reconstructed despite being born about 80 years after Igboland was first colonized by the British. The story follows Okonkwo, a prestigious and prosperous man who pulled himself out of poverty by his own strength in the fictional African village of Igwedo, home to the Umufia clan, of which Okonkwo is a prominent member, a lord in fact. You see, the Umufia clan, a man can only rise above their station through their strength from which all their worth as a person is derived. For a man must be strong to defend their clan, strong to perform the hard work required to support himself and his family, strong as to command the respect and obedience of said family. But it's not just the strength of the body which is valued amongst the Umufia clan, and indeed in all of Igwedo village, but also strength of character. Those men who adhere to the proper way of things, that is, to observe customs, uphold religious practices, show respect when respect is due, and demand respect when it is due to them, and just generally act as men should, are that much more likely to gain in status, which is measured in their number of wives, titles, likewise yams, the king of crops, and which is displayed by the quality of their households, or compounds, as they are called in the book, and which can be gathered by the esteem in which others regard you in. Conversely, lack of any aforementioned valued things lowers one's status. But that is how a man ascends in Igbo society. It is, however, how a man descends in the society imposed by the white man later in the book, as we see happen to the main character, Okonkwo, or rather, the world from which he held simply fell apart around him, and he could not accept that all that he was and all that he had worked so hard for had been rendered for naught in the new world brought on by the advent of white men and all they stood for. Things Fall Apart was a common story for those Africans and African cultures that underwent colonialism. Though the story itself is fiction, it perfectly portrays a societal transformation that played out countless times throughout colonial Africa, and we, the audience, are shown through Okonkwo and his village that story. Speaking of Okonkwo, in the end, Okonkwo's village was irreparably changed by colonialism and its spreading of commerce, Christianity, and civilization. Like crust beneath the earth pushing together, when cultures collide, they either synthesize and create something new, or one comes to dominate the other. A common story which repeats throughout history. And just like colliding crusts beneath the earth, there is often a friction between cultures, and we see that too near the end of Things Falls Apart, as tension between the Christians and traditional Igbo religion, a tension which ultimately gave way to the pacification of the Igbo people. At the risk of sounding cheesy, when things fall apart, it's often not that easy to put them back together. Today, Africa still deals with the fallout of its colonialization, something which stands like a cultural landmark and towers over the continent, casting its shadow over the people that lived there. After all, many African countries are still predominantly Christian to this day. And though colonialism is officially over on paper, it's often still in effect, as the countries which formerly colonized Africa still exploit it and its people for economic gain. Even the Catholic Church, which is needless to say a Christian institution, still holds heavy influence there. But we shouldn't conflate the legacy left to Africa with its future. Things are improving, and many countries there are as developed as what we would call the first world nations. Change is inevitable. We can't hold on to culture because it's not some fixed, tangible thing, pretty much by definition. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, so long as what we build after things inevitably fall apart is better. Thank you for listening. Hope you found this informative.